Kia ora Aotearoa, good evening and welcome to the Union Report, where we review the news week through the lens of industrial disputes with union leaders, commentators and politicians. Joining me tonight to discuss events is author, blogger and political commentator Chris Trotter and Dr. Alistair Shaw, Executive Director of the New Zealand University Students Association. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight, Issue 1. A new survey shows that bullying in the public service is rife. Do we have a bullying work culture and what do we do about it? Issue 2. Does labour skills shortage and rising unemployment suggest the 90-day right to sack law has failed and is now part of the problem? And Issue 3. Is the government doing enough to tackle poverty? Plus we'll wrap with a final thought. But let's start the show with Issue 1. A Victoria University study surveying more than 7,000 female Public Service Association members working in big organisations such as DHB's central or local government have found that bullying is common, with many managers seeing victimisation as a way of getting things done. Alistair, 1 in 3 children are bullied online and 43% of respondents in this survey felt bullied at work. Do we have a bullying culture that is expanding into our work culture in New Zealand?
I think we do have a bullying culture, which is that, and essentially it's a situation where the people who have power are being encouraged to abuse it.
Right.
And I know we saw when the Employment Contracts Act came in the early 1990s, there was a huge spike in sexual harassment.
Right.
Because basically bosses had been told, you've got the power now, go for it.
Sure.
And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now.
Yeah.
You know, sort of across society, where we have a situation where those who have power are encouraged to abuse it.
Are we teaching this into our kids? I mean, are we somehow not preventing the next generation of thinking that being abusive is acceptable in society?
Well, look at the role models.
Right.
Look at the people at the the very top of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
How do they behave?
Sure.
So everybody who's in a position of absolute vulnerability, who is prepared to talk about their story in terms of needing a tertiary incentive allowance or not being able to survive on the DPB, what happens? The minister goes for town on them.
Do you think that organisations need to have better bullying networks? I mean, I remember at university, certainly something the associations were very, very strong on, was having networks of people publicised very clearly around the university. If you feel that you're being threatened or there's a bullying or sexual harassment of any kind, any type of harassment, you could find someone who is well identified and you can go talk to them. I mean, are those the sort of strategies employers need to be seriously considering?
Well, I think we do need to have those networks and you do need to have those structures. But at the same time, we all need to take responsibility. And that sense, there's a whole lot of campaigns actually out there at the moment being initiated by community organisations that say, actually we all need to take responsibility.
Sure.
We all need to stand up. We all need to say, here's somebody who's in need and that's not okay.
Yeah.
And I think we need to extend that through to our political leaders and to say that their behaviour is not okay either.
Chris, many workers testifying at the Pike River inquiry said they felt concerns about work safety but didn't report it, fearing that they would lose their jobs. Do you think bullying's more rife when workers are feeling anxious about their job security?
Well, you've got to take everything right back to basics here, I think. And that is, when you step through the door of your workplace, you leave the democratic world behind. You enter what is essentially an authoritarian environment, or a tyranny almost, because, you know, in many cases, small to medium enterprises in particular, one person is the equivalent of, you know, a king, an emperor, a tyrant, whatever you want to call them. And, you know, it's as old as Machiavelli. Which would you rather be, sire, loved or feared? And the correct answer, according to Machiavelli, is better to be feared than to be loved. And, you know, the inculcation of fear is seen as part and parcel of leadership, particularly in New Zealand. I mean, I agree with Alistair that this country has a very authoritarian streak, very deep in its makeup. And it doesn't take a great deal of provocation to bring it right to the surface.
Right.
And the employment relationship is one where authoritarian tendencies, particularly among those who run businesses, are very strong, and employers, I imagine, move to the better to be feared than loved position almost without thinking, because, as you say, at school, once again, is it better to be feared or better to be loved? And everyone sees that the person who has the greatest strength, who is more guileful, more adept at making you feel about an inch high in front of all your classmates, is the person that everyone defers to.
Yeah.
Either that or the class clown. I mean, David Longy, in his biography, he talks about being a big boy and having to either learn how to fight or learn how to make people laugh.
Yeah.
And he obviously wasn't going to be a great fighter, so he learned to use his wits.
Yeah.
Now, that is just so much a part of New Zealand life. I mean, I remember my daughter at primary school, she was bullied. The parents of the kids responsible turned out to be on the board of trustees.
No way.
So, it brought home to me, with a bit of a jolt that authority, teaches its own code and passes it down through, one's offspring. They go to school, they replicate, the sort of behaviour which they absorb at home. And it doesn't surprise me. These figures do not surprise me. And in spite of the best efforts of those who would like to wage campaigns against bullying, I'm always a bit pessimistic, because it seems to me to be running against the grain of the whole of our society. We have a society that is hierarchical. We have an economic system that is essentially authoritarian vis-a-vis people who work for others. And how can you eliminate bullying from that sort of context?
Yeah. Alistair, PSA President Brenda Pilot says bullying is endemic in New Zealand workplaces, and the report suggests that women bear the full brunt of this bullying because sexism is an additional factor. 33% in the report said that they'd felt discriminated against. Is sexism, do you think, one of the root problems here?
Well, it seems to me there isn't an issue that's not gendered.
Yeah.
So naturally, if there's a hierarchy which exists and a difference of power which exists, then it's going to be replicated and played out and exacerbated within a hierarchical bullying environment.
Yeah.
And it's just another weapon, I suppose, that the abuser or the bullier has to be able to use. And often women are more vulnerable because of their, in a workplace situation, because of their parental responsibilities, which might need that they need more flexibility, or they're not able to work on past the scheduled time that they're meant to stop, or they or they have other responsibilities in terms of their caregiving, or we know, for example, that women are more financially vulnerable, more likely to have a student loan, more likely to be paying it off. And so there's a whole lot of circumstances which are gendered, which are going to make the situation more difficult.
Chris, if this is how workers are feeling in a work environment as highly unionised as the public sector, what's happening to workers without the protection of unions?
Well, this, of course, is the ongoing tragedy of what happened in 1991 with the Employment Contracts Act. I think it's around 8 or 9 out of 10 New Zealanders in the private sector now are unionised, meaning that over 90% are not. And of course, not having union representatives that they can call, not having a delegate on site that they can go to, their misfortunes go unreported. And I think it's important too to emphasise that some of the more recent cases, the high-profile cases, there's the John Dragicevic at the Auckland City Council, and Katrina Beisch at the Department of Building and Housing. These were people who were involved in these, really quite unsavoury incidents, and yet they remained in their positions. Now, of course, that is a tremendously loud signal to send to the workforce. In other words, the people who were on the receiving end of this got paid a bit of money and left their jobs, and the person who was responsible remained in place. If it had been an ordinary employee of the Department of Building and Housing who had sworn at someone and manhandled someone, I suspect they would have lost their jobs.
No.
But the CEO remained in place.
Final question of both of you. What do you think unions can do to protect workers from the impacts of bullying? What do you think the role is for the unions right now?
Well, partly it's about returning to the situation where everybody has a sense that they're part of something.
Right.
And as Chris has said, that's very difficult when the union coverage is so low. But we know that it is striking, isn't it, that even in the public service, this is still such a significant issue. But I think that my sense is that the political leadership's activities are part of our culture. That means that in the public service this is more dramatic than it has been.
Right.
But for all workers, the solidarity is through sticking together and protecting one another.
What do the unions need to do?
They need to campaign for the restoration of universal union membership.
Oh, amen.
I'm
glad someone came up with that.
I cannot, for the life of me, understand why the lessons of 20 years worth of experiment in this matter, have yet to be drawn. Either by the trade union movement itself, who should campaign unequivocally for the restoration of universal membership, but also by the Labour Party and the Green parties. I mean, there should simply be a broad front in terms of policy objectives to make sure that all New Zealanders have access to the protections of a trade union and can go to somebody who, in a sense, can equal in menace and power, the menace and power of the employer.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, unionists say 90-day work trials are freezing the labour market and contributing to skills shortages because workers fear losing their job. Chris, if you're a skilled worker and you've got financial obligations each month, like a mortgage to pay and a family to feed, will you risk all those commitments to take up a job that you might lose without any safeguards within 90 days of taking it up?
Well, obviously it's a huge disincentive. I think it's important, though, to draw a distinction between a very large firm, which probably has a pretty sophisticated human resources department, and a reasonable amount of sophisticated manpower planning. Right? A firm like that is not going to, take a punt. They're going to say, what do we need? What does that person need to bring to the job? I think you're probably pretty safe if you're applying for a job with a firm like that. But you're quite right, in small and medium enterprises, the people who seem to derive the most comfort from the 90-day probationary period, there would be very little in the way of incentive for you to leave your currently reasonably secure position and risk some kind of incompatibility with one of these little tyrants who then just shows you the door without having to say why and without any comeback on your part.
Do you think that is then a effect of the law that they didn't take into account when they passed it?
Well, I think they probably hoped that the economy would be growing a little faster than it is, and that the labour market would be a little more fluid, a little more flexible than it is. But certainly in times, if not of recession, of extremely low growth, such as we're in, you're quite right. Those who have jobs will tend to hold on to them for dear life. And so the kind of churn that's necessary to free up skills and make them available to other employers, that's been reduced considerably.
So that creative employment friction just doesn't exist in a market where everyone's freezing down.
Well, I mean, and the same thing is happening in a strange sort of way with the banks. I mean, they're sitting on literally billions of dollars, but no one's willing to invest it. It's the same. People are sitting on jobs they have, and they're not willing to risk changing them.
Alistair, Kate Wilkinson originally told the government not to expand these 90-day right to sack powers to all employers, and the last attempt to judge how well the law was working was taken over a 60-day period, not the 90 days where most of the opportunistic sackings would occur. Do you think this is just raw meat policy for the bosses rather than smart industrial relations?
Yeah, well, I think Chris is right. If there's an employer who has let's see, has the capacity to employ somebody that they actually want, with the skill set that they actually are looking for, then they don't need this legislation.
Right. Yeah.
And I think there's the churn that should be happening that isn't happening is people who are currently underemployed in terms of their skills, or they've grown beyond the job that they're in.
Yeah.
They're not going to move,
sure,
because they're afraid, of course, and naturally. So in that respect, it's bad industrial relations law, because it's actually bad for the economy.
Chris, the government claimed the 90-day right to sack law has created 13,000 new jobs, which the CTU argue isn't true. But with unemployment at 6.8%, isn't the proof in the pudding? This law's failed to lower the unemployment rate, has it?
Well, I'm not sure you can go quite that far. I think you might be on safer ground if you're referring specifically to Pacifica and Maori workers, or people trying to get into the workforce. Because youth unemployment among those groups is reasonably high, although not as high as it is in places like Spain.
No, well, Lord, that's
and among Pākehā New Zealanders, then I suspect this law may actually be having a reasonably benign effect, in as much as it is allowing these terribly brave employers,
terribly brave,
to take someone on, knowing that if it doesn't work out, that person can be sacked. And of course, this is just yet another testimony to the paucity of talent in the New Zealand employing fraternity, and it mostly is a fraternity. You know, the whole of the thrust of industrial relations in New Zealand since the early 90s has been really a series of gifts to bad employers. I mean, the ECA was the biggest gift of all, but this is another gift to employers, which enables them to once again be bad managers, bad stewards of their own workforce, their own outlay of capital, and you know, it is really past time that New Zealand stopped doing this, stopped subsidising the inability of its employers to do a decent job.
Yeah, Alistair, Employers and Manufacturers Association Employment Services Manager David Lowe says if employers are finding they can't fill positions, then they won't worry about the trial period. If that's true, shouldn't employers advertise that they'll waiver the 90-day right to sack so as to unfreeze the job market? I mean, if that's the issue, wouldn't we see adverts saying 90-day trials don't apply?
Yeah, I think the part of the problem is that the employers, having argued that they wanted this legislation, now are part of a sort of political struggle to defend it and to say that it's good. And which is why I think we see such absurd research that while attempting to investigate the 90-day trial period legislation, looks at it for 2 months instead of 3. And it's a you know, it's an issue that we talked about last time I was on the show, which is this lack of evidence-based policy making, because it's just become so political, and so, you know, in a negative sense, which is that we're not really interested in finding something that works. We just want something that suits some perception of ideology.
Sure. Final question to both of you on this. This was ACT Party policy. In light of John Banks' Kim.com donation scandal, do you think ACT would have kept Banks on as leader after a 90-day trial?
That's a very good question. Possibly not. It's very interesting, just watching the blogs, to see that Kate Wilkinson is now coming in for quite a bit of criticism.
Interesting, isn't it?
Led by Cam Slater at Whale Oil. But I find this fascinating. And if you put it together with Rodney Hyde's latest column,
interesting, isn't it?
You begin to see that there is, you know, a measure of dissatisfaction on the far right with Kate Wilkinson, and perhaps some pressure behind the scenes to replace her with someone more to the hardliners' liking. But you know, God help us all if that's successful.
Would ACT have kept John Banks on as leader after 90 days?
We have to remember the key thing about the 90-day legislation is that you dismiss somebody not for cause.
Yes.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 3. The CTU has launched a stinging criticism of the government's attempt at tackling poverty. Last week, the Reserve Bank sharply downgraded their previous growth predictions to 0.6% for the second quarter of this year. However, economists are now picking 0.3%, half of what the bank predicted last week. The economy is going from bad to worse, while our inequality is at an all-time high. Chris, other than Benny bashing, union bashing, tax cuts for the rich, and rivers of corporate welfare, is John Key all out of ideas on how we're going to solve poverty?
Well, I don't think they're out of ideas, but I think they're out of ideas that are palatable to the general public. So they won't mention the ideas that they do have, apart from the ones which seem to encourage right-wing voters to remain loyal to National, which is why you've got Ms. Bennett, bashing every beneficiary she can lay her chubby hands on, and this is part and parcel of National's approach to its second term, which strikes me as very, very different from its approach to the first term. I guess there is pressure there to embark on policies similar to those we see unfolding in Great Britain and in the States across the United States, rather than perhaps Obama's federal approach. But this government is ideologically incapable of adopting the measures necessary to get economic growth, and I think it lacks any personnel capable of changing that ideological positioning. A friend of mine, Dr. Chris Harris, has come up with a wonderful sort of historical kind of division of the right in New Zealand, what he calls red Tories and blue Tories. And throughout our history, there's been a bit of a battle between the red Tory and the blue Tory, the classic red Tory being someone like Rob Muldoon, the classic blue Tory being someone like Jenny Shipley. And I think there is a struggle going on within the National Party, not so much to defeat the red Tories, because I think John Key was only a very tactical red Tory. But there's a lot of feeling out there among right-wingers, that John Key is let side down.
Sure. And
they would probably see him, if not a red Tory, then certainly a pink Tory. So this kind of struggle, between the Tories who acknowledged that the state had a role in generating economic growth, and in making sure that wealth didn't become concentrated, in the very, very small peak of society, and those who just are classic laissez-faire, conservative economic managers, and I do see this term of the national government as being one where the clamour of the blue Tory is growing louder and louder.
Alistair, why isn't poverty a political issue for National? I mean, they're resistant to any poll downgrades whatsoever. We've got inequality at our highest level, 270,000 kids in poverty, and yet it just still has no impact on the National Party polls.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure how good the polls are in terms of what they're telling us about what New Zealanders think, because I think part of their problem is there's still a lack of leadership in terms of policy from the opposition parties.
Yes, absolutely.
And so we get a large number of people saying that they don't know, and what they're saying they don't know isn't necessarily, I don't know whether I'd like the National Party to continue with its ignorance of the question of poverty, but I'm not sure who I'd like to take the lead on this.
So when does it start biting them? When does it start? When do you start seeing, when the opposition comes up with better ideas?
Well, I don't know. I mean, even into the last election, of course, we saw a huge number of people who were undecided, many of whom didn't vote.
That's right.
But when those non-voters were polled further, they they turned out to just about all, even though it's not the way that sort of political scientists interpret the polls. They almost all were people who would have voted for someone other than the people who became the government. And I suspect that the situation continues.
Right.
I mean, poverty is such a blight. I mean, here we are, despite the appalling management of the economy and this period of sustained low growth recession. We're still one of the richest countries in the world. And the number of kids who are growing up in poverty, it's an absolute blight. And how could it not be an issue on which this government, like any, would have to be measured?
I just think though that the ideological, bifurcation of New Zealand is now so deep, and there is no countervailing ideology or, as there was in the past, religious set of values to, in a way, rein in the red and tooth and claw social Darwinist, capitalist ideological position. At least, even in the 30s, 40s, 50s, there was that Christian religious appeal to the powerful, to the wealthy, that they must consider, the least of their brethren as well as themselves. The decline of religion in a country like New Zealand, which is now, one of the most secular in the Western world, means that really once you've picked your side in the battle of rich and poor, there is no countervailing voice. I mean, the poor are poor because they deserve to be poor, because they haven't worked hard enough and they didn't get an education and they weren't clever enough, like Gina Reinhardt, to be born to a mining magnate. So tough for them. The really talented ones, the ones that have got true grit, will rise out of the morass, and good on them, and we will welcome them with open arms. The rest can go to hell. And
you think that's the cultural mindset we've got in this country at the moment?
That's what I'm afraid the right more and more believes.
We better wrap the show on final words. Alistair, your final word this week is?
Well, I wanted to talk about the the $1 billion that the government's planning to spend on consultants.
Yes.
Which is not just, of course, a question. It's a whole model of managerial, sort of neoliberal approach to running public services. In the university sector, or even the tertiary sector, last year $30 million got spent trying to encourage students to move from the capped number of students at one institution to the capped number of students at another institution. There's no public interest, and just this absurd waste of money. So we're told that there's no money, and it just seems that for some things there is profligacy is fine.
Remarkable.
And I think it's right to challenge the waste in the government sector, but the waste is not anywhere that anyone's talking about it. The waste is all the spending, where they're trying to replicate a corporate model, which just doesn't work.
Chris, your final word this week is?
Well, I'm just drawing perhaps trade unions' attention, trade unions in particular, to the other side of the devaluation argument. Now, we've heard a lot from Bill Rosenberg, from the CTU and from the Labour Party and the Green parties about the need to bring down the value of the New Zealand dollar to help our exporters. Well, of course, what we've seen in Europe, and most particularly in Greece, is that there is another kind of devaluation, what the European Central Bank calls internal devaluation. And that means limiting wages or driving them down, laying off thousands of state sector workers, withdrawing state services from your people, so that you become a low wage economy and are able thereby to compete. Whereas, the preferable, the more humane way would be to devalue the currency. What you do is you devalue the worth of your own people. Now, that is the other kind of devaluation. And I think at the same time as unions are talking about devaluing the currency by various means, they should be warning their own members against the alternative to that, which is internal devaluation. And you hear it in the Prime Minister's offhand remarks about competitiveness, improving labour flexibility. These are code words.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, Chris. That's it for the show. Check out our Facebook site for ongoing union campaigns and actions, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter account for all the latest show updates. Thanks for watching Aotearoa. Join us again 8 PM next Monday for the Union Report here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Good night, New Zealand.